So I've talked about how often to requeen. I've also talked about when, spring or autumn, to queen. Now I just want to spend a little bit of time in talking about how to requeen. And the options we have are mated queens, cells, usually protected cells we're putting in, or what has become popular in New Zealand just quite recently are virgins. These are, of course, the queens that have emerged from cells and haven't mated yet. There's something else that happens is the colonies requeen themselves, and perhaps I might spend a minute on that later. But we're talking about intentional requeening. Now, if you're putting in a mated queen, a lot of people expect it's going to work, that you're going to be able to queen a colony. But the success can vary. We did a trial where there was a problem when we were exporting queens to Canada that a lot of these mated queens were superseding. So we thought we would check to see whether we could work out why. So we brought a whole lot of queens, 10 queens of each of 10 queen producers, sent them to Fiji and back, which was about the same distance as to Canada. And we put them into colonies. There was a couple of interesting things we noticed. For 9 of the queen producers, no supersedure at all. They all went in there nicely, survived, but one of the commercial queen producers we bought queens of, 9 out of 10 superseded. So we know there is a supersedure issue out there, and that told us at least, you can't guarantee if you put a queen into a colony that it won't be superseded or just die and the colony be queenless. So what are the things that impact on it? The first one is how long they are in mating ukes. There was an Australian study done that found that if you just put the queens into a mating uke, let them just do one little brood cycle and ship them out to be put into a colony, they have quite a high supersedure rate, sometimes higher than 40%. But if you leave them in the colony for 4 or 5 or 6 supersedure cycles, the supersedure rate is much lower. So there's that issue. The other one is something we call parasitic mite syndrome, and we'll talk about that later when we're going through differential diagnosis. But a queen starts to lay drone eggs, and you see all these strange brood symptoms. And what that appears to be related, based on a study done in New Zealand, is that in the mating uke that you're putting the cell in so the queen gets mated, if there's not very many bees in there, and we don't know what not very many is at the moment, there's a greater likelihood that when you take the queen out of there, put her into a normal hive, she'll have parasitic mite syndrome and become a drone layer. So those are the two issues. So even if you're using mated queens, you still need to have a plan for what's going to happen if it doesn't work. Now cells, of course, have a built-in problem with them, that you normally only get 80% of success rate with queens, with cells any rate. The other 20%, we don't know why. It may be a problem with mating. The virgins might fly out there and die, but you really have to go back and patch up the other 20% after you've worked with cells. Virgins, we don't know about actually. We're assuming that it's 80%, the same as cells, but we just don't know. So if you're using cells and virgins, again, and it's really important that you have some way of patching up the ones that don't work. The other thing I see beekeepers doing that I'm a little bit unsure of, and this is requeening hives without removing the old queen. Now, if you look at the literature, everybody who does this reports that it's not very successful, that it may only be successful in 30% of the time. So people who are trying to requeen using that way may find that 70% of the time, all they're getting is the old queen. The answers for this one, we really don't know, but it's something to be careful of. If you are doing, you can check for yourself, and the way to do that is to buy queens that are already marked in some way, put them in your colonies and come back a month later and see if they're still there or not. So the important thing is whether you're using mated queens or whether you're doing cells, if you have to check that they've worked. And the way to do that is to come back the following week and check to see whether there's any queen cells there. If the cells haven't produced a mated queen, or your mated queen's not been successful, the colony should be trying to create their own cells, and you know it hasn't worked and you'll have to try again. It is a little more complicated than that sometimes with cells. We were doing some work with American Foulbrood where we were producing large numbers of cells and putting them in colonies. Sometimes those queens didn't get mated and didn't start laying for 4 or 5 weeks afterwards. that's probably a special case. So what we can offer at the moment is come back in 7 days and have a look to see whether there's queen cells there or not. So I guess to sum up, mated queen cells are probably the most successful, but there can be problems, so it's good to check. Virgins we know, cells we know about 80%, and virgins probably about that there is going to be a problem, so you should have a plan for being able to requeen your colonies, or at least 20% of them, when you come back to check to see whether your requeening has been successful or not. So lots of options, but for all of them, there's no guarantees here. And if you get it wrong, it may cost you on production, especially if you're doing it in the spring. So you have to come back and check.